Okay, we are streaming and recording. So over to you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first streamed Theoria book seminar. So my name is Lawrence Piper. I'm the current editor-in-chief of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory. We're published out of New York with Berghahn Press. And for more details, we will put those in the description of the video. But just to say that Theoria has South African origins as a journal, but we now look to position ourselves on the global stage and to try and bring Southern perspectives, theories, theorists, ideas, and so on and so forth into global debates and debates on global issues. We're very excited today to have our first book seminar of this sort, and we're going to be discussing this great book by Guido Parietti on the concept of power, possibility, necessity, and politics. Guido will speak for himself in a minute, but just to say that by way of introduction, that he is assistant professor in political theory and constitutional democracy at Michigan State University, having 2 PhDs. Seems a little excessive. 2 PhDs, very impressive. And we're very excited to, as I say, talk about his book. So maybe just to explain how we're going to go about this today, I'm going to start off by giving a very brief summary of the argument of the book. Then Guido will almost certainly correct me. And then we'll move to our 3 respondents, who will be Christine Hobden from University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, Lawrence Hamilton from partly Wits, same university as Christine, and partly Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and then Camilla Vergara, who I believe is at Essex. Correct, Camilla? Okay, very good. After that, Guido will respond to those comments, and then we'll open up for questions and comments from everyone. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So I'm just going to, apologies if this sounds a little red, but I think it's important to be reasonably accurate, as this is a carefully argued work of political philosophy. So in his 2022 book with Oxford University Press on the concept of power, possibility, necessity, and politics, Guido Parietti argues that the concept of power is consistently and wrongly apprehended in both the disciplines of political science and political philosophy. Consequently, most mainstream conceptions of power in the study of politics are either bad definitions, principally because they are circular, or they restrict the notion of power to some limited account of power over, which, in taking a subset for the whole, makes power about necessity rather than representing its broader and ordinary meaning, which is power based on the concept of possibility. At the core of the conceptual problem, then, is the tendency to frame power as about potentiality, that is, as necessarily orientated towards some end. And in this way, power is wrongly conceived as some kind of resource or a tool to be deployed towards this particular end. However, he argues power is best understood as a condition that an actor finds themselves in. That is to say, that power denotes, and I quote, a person's condition of having available possibilities for effective action and representing these conditions as such, end quote. He adds, I am powerful if I can perform some actions and at once see this performance as a possibility for me, which I may or may not actualize, rather than as a necessity. Parietti's On the Concept of Power is a closely argued work of political philosophy that engages with ideas, thinkers, and debates that cut to the heart of the political. 2 points by way of closure of this short summary. First, Parietti's argument proceeds by way of rooting the meaning of power in language, and especially in ordinary language, and reconnecting this with the specialized use of the term in political science and philosophy. The conceptions or theories that build on the misapprehension of power as potentiality distort the ordinary language meaning of power, but they can still stand as empirical theories of, for example, coercion. So in part, the issue is one of naming. But secondly, in reconstructing the meaning of power as possibility, a task explicitly required in English rather than some of the Romance languages, where the more general word for power is clearly distinguished from the English use of power as potentiality, Parietti goes further to build a conception of politics that heavily tracks Arendt's thought. He starts by noting that politics is a context where power is present. That is, the condition in which possibilities are available to people. Further, while politics is enabled by language, it requires dedicated spaces for its enactment, such that people can see themselves and others, and likewise be seen as actors. Such spaces should be inclusive and free to enable deliberation on the common concerns, and these spaces need to be protected by constitutions and laws. This politics is truly about possibilities rather than necessities, a contrast nicely captured in the moment of debate over a law rather than the coercive imposition of the same law. The former is power as possibility and the proper space of politics. The latter is power as potentiality and the domain of control or governance. In refocusing the meaning of power and possibility rather than potentiality, Parietti not only runs a rapier sword through the loose conceptual thinking of received political analysis, but also presents an affirmative account of politics as necessarily involving representation, judgment, interpretation, and possibilities that are irreducible to algorithms or artificial intelligence. Politics, properly conceived and protected, is the drama of us performing the choice of our collective possibilities together. So that is my summary of Guido's argument. So I'm now going to ask Guido to respond and to correct, add, elaborate a little bit, if you want to. So over to you.
Oh, thank you. No, I have no correction. Perhaps just a couple of words more to explain the context and where the book is coming from and where the argument attempts to go, right? So basically, the distant origin of the book does indeed go back to my unsatisfaction with the general conceptions of politics that I could find around, when as a young student I was studying philosophy in Italy. And part of this dissatisfaction was precisely with the fact that basically in different ways, all these conceptions tended to be teleologically oriented towards some result or end state that they imagined they wanted to achieve, which always struck a chord with me as something wrong, in the sense that it can work within politics, within political conceptions, but there are conditions for our capacity to pursue our end politically that are not captured, that cannot be captured if we define politics itself according to our end. If you try to construct a domain of action in a way that is predetermined, what we end up doing is essentially prefiguring a system of coercion and control that doesn't allow for freedom and power and all the other things that nominally we are so concerned and careful about safeguarding, right? So that is sort of the distant origin of my general interest in politics. And then, of course, later on in a graduate seminar, also in Italy, I first struck the definition of power given by Stephen Lukes and all the debate before and after it. And I was very struck by how these definitions were lacking, in my view. And I came to realize that they were lacking because they didn't take seriously ordinary language as their starting point, right? They gave definitions that worked, function within their own theoretical framework, within the ends that they wanted to pursue with their theoretical framework, but didn't cohere with how we use power in ordinary language. And so that became sort of my starting point, trying to understand and unfold the meaning and implications of this concept as it exists amongst ordinary speakers, right? And in this way, I think, not surprisingly, we can also get to an understanding of politics that is not prejudged in favor of one or another teleological vision, a conception of politics that is not be held to one particular theoretical framework to the exclusion of the others. Now, of course, the price that you pay for that is that you don't present a full conception yourself, because that would be sort of self-contradictory. And so basically, after all the work to, painstakingly notice all the ways in which previous definitions were problematic and trying to present and explain a definition that more closely tracks ordinary language, the payoff is relatively modest, because what I'm doing is simply trying to laying out the conditions according to which it is possible for us to have power. And only possible, because of course the practicality of any situation transcends what any theorist might hope to determine. And so that's where we end at, right? One thing that perhaps I want to expand on or try to clarify in relation to Lawrence's introduction is that, the idea of politics, the conception of politics that I arrive at, in my view, is the one that is coherent with a proper understanding of power, on the assumption that power is at the very least necessary to define the domain of politics, right? So the claim starts from the definitional. The claim is conceptual. It's not that I have in mind a sort of good vision of how politics should look like, and then I construct the theory backwards, right? Personally, like all of us, I have many more desiderata from politics, right? But those go beyond what you can extract from an understanding of power and an understanding of politics as the domain for power. And so in this sense, there is also a sort of I'm blanking on the English word. There is sort of a parsimonious approach to define the more normative part of the theory, because the moment you switch from merely defining the concept to articulate a broader conception, you immediately take on more and more normative demands, and on the strength of the experience of observing how so many others have gone wrong in that direction. I want to make sure that I always stay with the coherence with ordinary language as my starting point, even though me personally, like all of you, would have many more ideas about what kind of politics and what kind of political program would be preferable, right? And so as it pertains to the book, the claim is not that, if we let ourselves be governed by our AI overlords, that is bad. I mean, it is bad. But the reason why that is not politics is simply that that kind of dystopia would extinguish the space for us experiencing ourselves as powerful actors, right? Then with our power, we can do good or evil, we can do all sorts of things. But that's simply the kind of claim that I put forward. And I think I would shut up now to leave more space for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And just before we hand over to our three respondents, just to say, as someone who's read the power literature over many years, that your rendition of it was still illuminating and refreshing and profound, I must say. It was an amazing piece of work. Okay, so I think we'll go in the order, Christine Hobden, Lawrence Hamilton, and then Camilla Vergara. And if I can ask each of you just briefly also to introduce yourself as you would like. So if that's okay, I'm going to hand over to Christine.
Sure, that's okay with me if the others are happy with that order. Hi, so I am Christine Hobden. I am a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. So it's an interdisciplinary space, and I'm there as a specialist in public ethics, but I come from a political theory background. And I'll say a little bit more about some of that in my response. But yes, thanks so much for the opportunity to engage with the book. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. I'm not somebody who has very extensively engaged with the power literature, so it was certainly a great kind of in-depth introduction beyond that of graduate school. I thought what might be interesting and useful as my contribution, we have a very brief amount of time. I'm not going to focus so much on critique, but thinking about my position as what I think could be broadly defined as a liberal political theorist in the analytic tradition. Really some really important and interesting critique of the field in the book, but also I think some interesting seeds of how to think about going forward with some of these ideas, particularly in thinking about reimagining our politics. So I'm going to say a little bit about what I really saw as the interesting contributions that relates to some of the ideas I'm interested in. So I draw upon kind of two aspects of the book that I think have already been briefly touched on. The first is the conceptual analysis is insight that with power being the condition of having possibilities and representing them as such, power is removed from the realm of the necessary. Yet we know in so much of our politics today, this idea of the necessary looms really large, the space in which we feel like we have no choice. And that's true, I think, in political life and theorizing and imagination of political space. And the second is this part right towards the end when we start to speak about power and the spaces of appearances, which we've already seen touched on a little bit here. And I really love the discussion around the task of kind of constantly renewing and remaking the space of appearances. That space where we can represent our possibilities to each other, where power and so our political agency is available to us. And I think it really kind of makes the point that this opens the pathways for us to notice, as is argued throughout the book, I think, that the relevant distinction is between possibilities and necessities when we're thinking about the political space. But also, I would argue, the related distinction often drawn on the other side between that which is possible and that which is impossible. So while it's not framed that way in the book, I suggest that we should also notice that society's confused relationship to the necessary not only shapes what is understood as compulsory, these areas where we feel we have to act in certain ways, we don't have choice, but also what as a result is then ruled out as impossible. So perhaps moving a bit beyond the core of Paretti's claims, I would also emphasize that in order to tend to the space of appearances, to create meaningful space for political agency that's separate from necessity, we also need to tend to the real and perceived boundaries between the possible and the impossible. So in the book, politics is described as the art of the possible, as opposed to the morally perfect or the necessary. Yet, if we think about it from the lens of the distinction between the possible and impossible, and particularly, I think, when we have attention to particularly oppressive circumstances, others have considered it more apt or perhaps rhetorically powerful to describe politics as the art of the impossible. So, with apologies to some colleagues on the call who've heard me talk about Rick Turner a lot of late, I was really struck by some of the synergy here in reading the book. So Rick Turner is an anti-apartheid activist and scholar. And in his book, The Eye of the Needle, he has an argument on the necessity of utopian thinking. And his argument rests on an insight similar to, I think, described in the book, that we often tend to view social norms and institutions as necessary. Like mountains, we can only work around rather than products of our collective choices and patterns of behavior. We see the present in isolation without considering its place in history, And so we obscure much of what is actually changeable in our politics and our society. And we see this kind of argument in the book as well, where we talk about an ideology playing a role, creating a backdrop, a really strong idea of what is necessary, at least until, and this is a quote, someone finds the initiative and courage to question it publicly, and in that recreates at once a space of possibility. So while we might worry that strongly moralizing notions of the utopian attempt to rule out possibility, they do exactly this thing of aiming towards something particular, and so might fall prey to the book's critique of ruling out power in our politics. I think this different perspective highlights something different, that the articulation of a utopian ideal, which is kind of necessarily and by definition different to our current reality, can also burst ideological conformity in ways that reopen possibility for us. So I think in this sense, political theories that articulate a normative vision of the ideal, particularly taken together as a project, and of course done in particular ways, can have an important societal role, not through presenting one path forward, but through keeping the realm of possibility wide and alive, even in contexts where governance reinforces a narrative of necessity rooted in some particular ideology. And, you know, this has some value in how we think about our work as political theorists in the academy, but I think more relevantly, perhaps about how we think of political theory, political philosophy, in the realm of political activism and public political philosophy, beyond kind of analysis of particular situations. There's a useful place for articulating ideal visions, not just for creating hope as it's often framed, but for reclaiming the space for power and reclaiming power itself, perhaps. So just in conclusion, I know I'm going a tiny bit longer than given. I think for me, a strong takeaway of what is a very conceptual analysis of the concept of power is that with attention on power, not just about having possibilities, but noticing them and articulating them to ourselves and others, it creates many more avenues to kind of reimagine and rethink about how to claim power, even in repressive contexts. And in reflection in my own work, I think it speaks to this use of ideal theorizing I've just spoken about, but also can provide very strong foundations to discuss citizens' collective power in politics, a topic very central to my own work. And I think, as Lawrence suggested in his opening, really the heart of politics, the drama of us performing the choice of our collective possibilities together. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Guido.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christine. All right. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Lawrence Hamilton. Again, introduce yourself as you see fit and then proceed with your comments. Thanks.
Hi, Lawrence and all. Thanks very much. I'm Lawrence Hamilton. I'm SA UK Bilateral Chair in Political Theory at Wits and Cambridge. And yeah, I think this is a really excellent account. It merits and requires close reading and makes a serious advance on previous accounts of power, which, as Lawrence has suggested, is no mean feat, given how much Luke's and others, for example, Foucault, have shaped our understanding of freedom up till now. I think overall it's really successful, and I'm convinced of the main thesis, which we've already heard articulated. But let me just remind us of the best version of your definition. Power is, I quote, a person's state of having possibilities for action and representing them to themselves as such. That's on 225. As you articulate earlier too, on page 60, there are two central components to this. First, I am powerful if I can perform some actions. And second, and at once see this performance as a possibility for me. Just as an aside, and although B may not be as present for them, the people I'm about to speak about, I was just wondering how different this is to a certain view of Karl Marx's account, for example, that the idea of power as possibility, or as entailing freedom, as you say. The idea that power is the conjunction of the ability to determine what one will do and do what one decides to do, or have the possibility to decide what one decides to do. Also, Dewey's account of effective power, the demand and capability to do certain specific things. And even if in its own formulation it's bereft of any real analysis of power, is this not right at the core of Sen's capability approach, for example, which focuses very firmly, as you know, on choice? And I was quite surprised not to see any, bringing some of that literature in around choice. So maybe it'd be quite interesting to hear what you have to say about choice around that. In other words, if power is about possibility, is it not ultimately about capability, to use Sen's language, where the latter is not just understood as ability, but the conditions and possibilities to enact that ability? So that's kind of a first point, if you want. I'm just going to make 4 quick points. And I should have said at the start, they'll sound like critiques, but they're not. They just should be thought of as ways in which I suppose components of the book made me go off at different tangents to maybe the way in which you went to. Secondly, thus your emphasis on actors, representation, a shared world, appearance, and the constitutive nature of language. And I suppose, although I don't know which way around this came to you, the appeal of Hannah Arendt as a consequence. But I can have all of these things that you speak about, and that I'd like to say more about, but I won't have the time. I can have power in the way you specify as even as the controller of detonating a bomb, for example, in the sense that I have the possibility to press the button or not. I can have possibilities and I can present them to myself. And yet you and Arendt would say that I do not have power, as I'm not acting as part of a shared linguistic world, or that in some sense the real power lies with the properly political actor, the leader, making the judgment to bomb X or Y. But I do have power, as I have power to judge, represent, and act. Why am I thus not a political actor? Maybe I've got that wrong, but there you go. And yet, or moreover, in a really important sense, my power in this example is silent power. And this brings me to my third point. As you argue really convincingly, judgment plays a central role in your account of power. Power is possibility mediated by representation, as you put it. This is brought out neatly in your discussion of virtue in Machiavelli, the root of our term virtual, which underscores the connection between representation and the modality of possibility. This is your discussion on page 95. And I quote you, judgment is coextensive with the capacity to entertain representations. That's actually, sorry, on page 138. Which you argue as central to understanding power from the first person actor and the third person observer perspective. The beginnings of an intersubjective account, you suggest. I'm intrigued by your views on judgment, but again, for reasons of time, we'll leave them to one side. Maybe we can come back to this. What I think is important in this insight is linked to an argument about the constitutive nature of language in these dynamics and thus in politics, or at least that linguistic representations are a root condition for power, if I have that right. But what of what we might call silent power? I can think of a lot of ways in which people can act powerfully without words. Religious zealots immolating themselves to make a statement, oppressed wives silently but powerfully getting what they want or need from an overbearing husband without confronting them verbally, etc., etc., etc. But an example first brought out by Raymond Goyce makes the point really, really well. The attacks on the Pentagon in Washington and the World Trade Center in New York, what is now called 9/11. One, of course, does not have to agree with what they did to recognize that the perpetrators exercised power. They subverted US military power and caused it to quote Goyce, discharge itself in politically self-destructive ways, end quote. And they exercised this power in a remarkably imaginative way, completely silently or wordlessly. There was no reading out of a set of demands in front of TV cameras, no explanation, no public announcement, etc. They enacted significant power without saying a word. I'm not bringing this up in any sense to try to refute your argument, but just to suggest that you may be remaining too loyal to Arendt. For all the reasons you articulate so well, she needs language to be phenomenologically prior to power. For her, how would they even be a world to act in or on without language? But maybe you, Guido, don't need this in the same way that she does. Perhaps in contradistinction to Arendt, Habermas, and many liberal political theorists in different ways, of course, maybe there can be possibilities for action and even ways of self-representation that stand prior to, or at least alongside, language. The body, pleasures, feelings, emotions, needs, etc. And this brings me to my last point, and it actually connects to quite a lot of what Christine was saying about necessity. Needless to say, a lot of you know a lot more than I do about what Foucault said about power and how he brings in sex, not as a counter to the discourse of sexuality, but as a way of showing that even in the various forms the discourse of sexuality has prevailed, the power we have to counter it is not to revert to some kind of argument re the nature of sex, but to sink into our bodies and pleasure and thus confront these narratives. So it's a kind of, he does this in various different ways, in various different places, but in this particular way, he, as it were, makes this point about sinking into something that we might call necessity. I want, though, to end with a different example, which I think confronts your central binary between power and necessity. And the example is from Nelson Mandela's speech, his famous Rivonia trial speech, in which he makes a very firm claim about the necessity to bear arms. In short, it's an argument about at what point the African National Congress came to the realization that it was under a kind of a necessity based upon the fact that the apartheid state was, every time they were attempting to do things using words, in other words, words or various forms of mobilization in other ways, but effectively using words, they were being met with sheer force. And so they basically, it's a retrospective justification for the necessity to bear arms. That's effectively what a large part of the Rivonia trial speech is. But the judgment at the time to bear arms came from a condition of necessity brought about by the apartheid state. So my question to you is, why exclude necessity from your account of power? Many acts of power emerge, I would argue, out of conditions of necessity. It's not for nothing that we say that necessity is the mother of invention. If your insistence on this distinction is due to your fealty to Arendt, I would urge you to be less loyal. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence, for sharing your traitor's heart with us. I'm going to ask now Camilla to be our final respondent, and please introduce yourself as you see fit.
Thank you. Thank you. So Camila Vergara, I am a senior lecturer at University of Essex. I'm a political theorist, a constitutional scholar, and I dedicate to plebeian politics. This is basically my beat. I wanted to give a little bit of context about, the book. We were, with Guido, we were classmates. We were in the same cohort at our PhD at Columbia. So I could see the development of the book and, this wrestling with the details of, how to construct the concept and what is wrong with it and how can we better understand it. And of course, I deal with, plebeian politics, the politics from below, and the concept of power and the idea of power. Where is power and how can we use it if there is a thing called power? It was part of how I thought about power before reading this book. So this book basically changed my way of approaching the concept, making it more difficult for me to just use the word power without even thinking about it. We just slap power everywhere. Power is everywhere, right? But at the end, after reading this book, we see that power is not everywhere. That is really something very specific as a way of a possibility that can be acted upon, and not just whatever we think it is power, right? So I want to detain myself first on the kind of methodological chapter, which I think it is very illuminating for the people that do conceptual theory, in order to see the difficulties of defining something as power that is not an object, that is not a thing, right? So this is the kind of the difficulty. Power is not something that we can possess, it's not something that we can see, and therefore we need to understand the concept as separated from the conceptualizations of this power, of the interpretations of this very abstract way of thinking, in a way that is not really related to something that is objective, right? So I want to refer my comments, and I think everything has been said in a way that has been very thorough. I want to put my comments on the gap between the formal and the material, specifically in terms of what we are living today as citizens of the world, and the power that we are able to wield in these situations. So are we, in your definition, we have this possibility that can be acted upon. However, the formalities of power, so our formal structure in a way allows us for a wiggle room of action. However, we have seen today that space of action is really almost not existent in terms of the actual engaging in powerful action, right? So if we think about the genocide going on in Gaza today, if we think about more than a year in a way that we have been witnessing obvious war crimes and obvious attempts of ethnic cleansing, we have structure, an international structure with institutions that have been giving us the realm of possibilities for citizens to act within their own countries and the countries in this international arena. However, we have been really impotent in doing anything about it. So I would like for you to respond in a way to how do you see power in this gap between the formal and the material, in our actual possibilities, even if we can think about formally that we have these possibilities. If we cannot imagine, and this is kind of beyond the material, if we cannot imagine our possibilities beyond what the structure gives us, then we're impotent in a way. So what is the role of imagination in the stretching of our capacity to act in our power in your theory, and if you can kind of elaborate a little bit in how can this be useful for us in terms of acknowledging the powerlessness that we endure today, and how can we enlarge those possibilities in order to be powerful? How can we be powerful as citizens of the world to change the world and not merely act upon a very specific ends, as you say, that is like the probability of it, in a way, something that is already determined. We need to go beyond what we already have. So how can we use this idea, this concept of power that is very specific, into kind of pushing us there, first in basically acknowledging what we have in our powerlessness, and how can we build upon it? So I want to be very brief, because I think we have a little time, and I want to dedicate more time to the Q&A and the fantastic discussion that we have had so far. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you to all our respondents. I know there's a whole litany of points that have been raised, Guido, and it's I don't think you're obligated to answer all of them, but if you'd like to take a little bit of time to respond to those comments now, that would be great. And then after that, we can open up for questions from everyone in the room.
Yes, thank you. There is indeed a lot of material to go through. So I will go in order as the comments were presented. So in relation to Christine's point, I basically simply agree. Like, I don't have much to add. I think that kind of approach is exactly what I would hope my work on the concept of power would be useful for, like clarifying what is happening, for example, when we are contesting the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, right? So I think that's perfectly consonant with what I'm doing, right? When there is something that is proclaimed as impossible, and then a utopian thought or some sort of radical actor questions that, what is happening is precisely opening up a new space for possibility for what was previously impossible. And, you know, you can get a lot more complex about that, but that's the work for Christine and not for me, when I am an humble conceptual analyst. But you know, like, I think what is happening there is precisely the enlarging of the domain available for power by contesting the boundaries of the possible and the impossible, right? So yeah, I think that the sort of utopia can also have an additional role in the sense of opening up possibilities that are not the utopian possibility, but are made visible and representable by the utopian possibility, right? There is also, of course, the case in which utopias can become instead stifling for action, as Christine mentioned. For example, by you know, presenting a vision that is just so removed from what we can actually achieve that it fosters discouragement rather than enthusiasm. But that depends on the specific case, right? How I see my role as a theorist is simply to try to clarify the conceptual framework through which we can think and understand and discriminate between these different cases, right? And so in the case of utopian thinking, trying to make sure that it is used in a way that makes us more powerful rather than less. So yeah, I simply basically agree with all the comments from Christine. So sorry, this is going to be the briefest part, but it's simply because I find that very, very consonant already. Okay, as for the many interesting and challenging points by Lawrence, so there's a lot of stuff here. So first of all, I'll try to go in order. How is it different from Marx or Dewey, or you could have added many more? Well, I don't think it's necessarily different in the sense that many people, including many theorists and philosophers who have talked about power, have talked in a way that makes sense insofar as they were using power in a sort of pre-theoretical way within their theories. The problem, the tricky issue comes when theorists try to theorize power itself as a piece of their own theories, right? Now, Marx in particular may have other problems because of his strong teleological historicism, but in general, when you read Marx and you read Marx talking about power, I don't find any particular problem there, right? The problems come when the theorists, the political scientists, the philosophers arrive with all their theoretical baggage and try to construct the concept of power in accord with those ideas, and by doing so, they programmatically detach themselves from the ordinary meaning of the concept, right? So it's not surprising if you find similarities or coherence with the work of such different thinkers, because that's precisely what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do justice to the ordinary meaning of the concept. So I am guilty as charged about the capabilities approach and its relation to power. There's only so much that one can study and try to fit into a book. So I'm guilty there. My sense is that perhaps a piece of the difference there is that capabilities, specific capabilities are powers in the sense of capacities, of being oriented towards certain specific actualization. So the sort of whole set of capabilities available to someone is certainly coherent and consistent with their power. And so there, my addition would simply be more emphasis on the representational aspect as well, like how can we make use of all these capabilities is an inextricable part of our power in addition to the various capabilities, right? And perhaps the other thing, but I'm on an uncertain terrain here because I haven't studied the issue in depth, is that there might be some sort of liberal individualism underpinning the capability approach that may or may not be coherent with an understanding of power as based on the representation of possibility. But as I said, I don't really want to go there because I haven't studied the matter seriously enough yet. Okay. Then for the second question, the second and the fourth actually goes, well, they're all sort of cohere around the issue of the relationship with Arendt and language and the representation of possibility. So again, go in order. So the possibility of detonating a bomb or, using a weapon or applying violence. I wouldn't say that you don't have power in that case. It depends on the specifics of the case. For example, if you receive an order to blow up Ponte Vecchio in Florence and you carry that order out, then you're not exercising power. You're simply obeying the necessary chain of commands. But if you use your judgment and you refuse to obey that order, that is indeed a political act and one of significance. So there could be power in the application or in the refusal to apply violence, both, right? I have an example in the book while I'm criticizing Rainer Forst's understanding of power that goes precisely in that direction, right? Because you can have power, for example, to silently apply violence to someone, right? I don't deny that. But the point is, are you representing that violent action as something that is possible for you or not? Or are you compelled by whatever other sorts of necessity? That's the distinction. And my claim is not that language has to be present in the moment in which you are employing your power. My claim is that in order for you to be capable of conceiving of the application, for example, of violence as a power, you must be in a linguistic context, because outside of that, I don't think you have the capacity to represent different possibilities. So there is a strong connection between power and language through the representational capacities of language, but that doesn't mean that power only exists where there is language. That would be sort of forced position, which I reject. I think forced correctly focuses on the connection, but it gets the connection wrong. It goes too far in saying that there can only be power in the space of reason. I think that's plainly inconsistent with how we use the word power. So I do agree that like you can have power to do things like using a weapon, detonating a bomb, or committing a violent act. But it's not the violence that makes the power. It's the representation of possibility that you may or may not have, right? So the example of the 9/11 attack is interesting. Like, did they exercise power? Well, it depends on how, on our account, on our understanding, on how these people saw themselves, right? So first of all, they did use language plainly, like from their interpretation of the Quran to their organizing of the plan to the propaganda of Al-Qaeda. There was language involved all the way, so that they use language. So the point is, were these people actually representing themselves as doing something possible for them, or they were so steeped in their fundamentalism and their ideology that they just perceive themselves as sort of blind transmitters of a higher power in the sense of potentiality in this case? I don't know. I suspect it varies depending on which of the people involved we're talking about, but that's exactly the kind of empirical question that I cannot answer a priori, but perhaps I can help clarifying with a conceptual work, right? So regarding Foucault and discourse about sex or discourse in general, so I wish I had done more about Foucault as well, but again, there is only so much one can do. But I think that Foucault is an interesting case because on the one hand, his discussion of power is meant to emphasize how things are contingent and to a certain degree arbitrary. But at the same time, he also uses power in a way that is heavily on the side of the systemic, the discourse, that sort of obscure the dimension of possibility, at least from the point of view of those involved in the working of this power, right? So I think there is a sort of internal tension, because Foucault, against the structuralists that he was reacting to, wanted to emphasize that power is indeed power, is arbitrary, is something that is done by someone at a certain point, right? But he also uses a lot of the same structuralist conceptual apparatus to depict power in a way that is, or at least is read as being depersonalized, non-agentic, structural. And, you know, as I noted in the book, Foucault himself eventually said that he was probably not really talking about power with all the things that he wrote about power. So I'm not in bad company in noticing this point, right? And so to conclude, the binary between power and necessity. This is an important point, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. So when I say that power has to do with the dimension or the condition of possibility, I don't mean to exclude necessity. In fact, there is always some sort of connection, because power, in order to be a relevant power, is the power to cause something in the world, right? Otherwise, we're just, you know, ivory tower theorists, and nobody likes those, right? So there is a connection with necessity, both in the sense of the necessary effects of what we use our power for, and of the necessity that from all different sides shape and constrains our possibilities, right? So in that sense, perhaps it is misleading that there is so much emphasis on possibility, but the reason why is because this dimension has been quite thoroughly disregarded by previous approaches on power. So you might get the impression that I'm sort of trying to do propaganda in favor of possibility against necessity, but that is not what I want to do. I just want to try to place these concepts and these modalities in their proper relation, right? So there is certainly space for recognizing necessity and the way in which it shapes our power, etc., right? About the necessity to bear arms, again, it depends on the circumstances, and I'm not familiar with the specific of the historical case, right? But I think that certainly a political leader or a political movement can make an argument for the necessity to bear arms in the given condition, and that can result in an expansion of their power, right? At the same time, the moment you start a violent engagement, you are also sort of placing yourself in a chain of necessity, right? Again, it's always negotiating the boundaries between what's necessary and what's possible. That is sort of the work of a politician, of a leader, because that is what is politics, essentially, always trying to carve out a space of the possible out of the necessity, which otherwise would press us from all sides, right? And so, yeah, in some cases, it makes sense that you have to oppose violence to violence. The difference is sort of how you get there and what happens after, right? So I don't think that the sort of engagement in battle is an example of power, but it can fit within a context in which there is power both before and after, and in the context around it, right? So I don't deny that. So is this distancing myself from Arendt? I guess there are different interpretations of Arendt. My interpretation is that Arendt is much less sort of rose-colored glasses kind of theorist about power, and she's actually perfectly open to recognize all these aspects. But if you disagree with me on the interpretation of Arendt, then that's fine, and then I'm distancing myself from Arendt. I have no fealty to anyone, much less a dead political theorist. I mean, I love Arendt, but I don't have fealty to her, right? So I hope that covers most of the points. And then to Camilla's point. This is perhaps the most difficult one. So Camilla always wants me to become a good radical theorist like she is, and I struggle with that because, you know, this conception is open to different perspectives, right? And so you could potentially understand it and agree with it from very different like points of view. You could be a normie, you could be a right wing, you could be a left wing. I don't think that there is necessarily the strong implication that Camilla is seeking for me. However, I think what can be drawn from the conceptualization of power is once again a more precise understanding of what is going on. So, for example, in the conflict in Israel and Palestine, it seems to me that what has been happening for a long time is that everyone is locked in an horizon of necessity where there is no space for possibility. There are religious claims, strong religious claim being pressed. Like people are like expropriating land from the Palestinian, sometimes on the strength of a religious claim that goes back to their faith. Well, in that context, there is no possibility for politics. There is only possibility for violence, right? Either the settlers will perform violence on the Palestinians, or the settlers will be violently expelled from the settlements that they have occupied. Unfortunately, that is what happens when we let go of the space of possibility and we become just sort of blindly governed by something that we perceive as a necessity, even if someone like me or Camilla can see that not as a necessity because we don't share the same religious commitments, etc. There is, of course, the issue of security and the fear, etc., which also plays into that. And there is, of course, from the side of the Palestinian, the issue of mere survival, which is also a compelling necessity. So it is a very unpromising situation. Nevertheless, we have experience in history of often being surprised by sudden explosions of possibility, even where they seemed impossible. So I'm not optimistic, unfortunately, but the way I would frame this issue is that one of the reasons why, sort of the deeper philosophical reason why the conflict has become so impossible to contend with is that it has been more and more pushed into a domain of sheer necessity, in which the Palestinian have the necessity to survive and to have a land in which to live, and the Israeli perceive themselves as being compelled by the necessity to either defend themselves or, in some cases, in the more extreme cases, realize a sort of messianic religious vision. And in that context, there is indeed no space for power. And you could go on. I mean, again, I'm not an expert, so I'm probably making a fool of myself. But one could also argue that, the actions of Netanyahu in recent years have been compelled by the necessity of avoiding judicial consequences for other things that he has been doing, and that has pushed him also further in a certain direction. Like, that is the case. That is the bad case. That's what happens when politics is sort of pushed to the margins, disappears, and what you have is just sheer necessity, right? So that is the case that oftentimes is conceptualized as being sheer opposition of power against power, brute power, right? Well, what I want to say is that if that's the case, if that is a decent sketch of how the situation is playing out, in fact, the problem is a complete lack of power, not the presence of too much power. Or in other words, there is a lot of power as potentiality, as the capacity to inflict violence and coercion, but there is hardly much power in terms of what's possible, right? And so this is a particularly salient and tragic case, but it's not an uncommon phenomenon. In different degrees, people seems to be very amenable to sort of push themselves and others in the direction of necessity, right? So I'm sorry for my inadequacy to say anything relevant about what is happening, but yeah, that's what I got.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Guido. A whole range of fascinating issues have been raised, and including some illuminating examples, I would say. So we have about 25 minutes or so left. So we have time for questions, and it'd be good if we could allow maybe other people, if they would like to ask questions, to do so. So you can either just raise your hand or write something in the chat, whichever you prefer. Yes, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for really nice discussion and debates. My name is Peter Jensen. I'm associate professor at Roskilde University. I'm not a philosopher and not a political scientist either. I'm even such a bad thing as a psychologist. I work in organization psychologist, but I'm very intrigued and been very fascinated with the work of Parietti. So I'm going to ask a little bit of a different questions. But first of all, in the framing, your work was presented as opposing a concept of power as domination. But in my view, and also how you're framing the book, it's a concept that addresses that most of the definitions we have, even though they are theoretical, are operational by nature. So it's about presenting trying to answer what is the minimum, the bare necessities of how we can use that word in a meaningful way. And I'm fascinated with how that evokes an age-old story of how power obviously relates to a sense of agency. So there's a subjective dimension, and I really like that you bring what I would consider reciprocity into it, because if you take the concept of possibility, you show that you need some things to, so it's an emergent property of objective reality, real possibilities, and a conception of or subjective conception of these possibilities as they are experienced. But I have a question, because we talk a lot about the first and the third dimension of your definition, namely the appearances aspect and the possibility aspect. But there's a second one that in which you talk about you have to conceptualize it as possibilities that are effectful or efficient, and you are able to represent them as such. But that efficiency, as the way you argue for it in your book and now, I would say that what you're talking about is a conception of these possibilities has to be relevant, meaningful. And that brings the subjective dimension stronger into play. I think that's very important, since then it becomes the question of meaning. Then it also opens up the question of whether or not how much is language. Does it have to be language that represented? Because the word world for me is also loaded with meaning. If I look at a chair, it's a thing, but it's also a possibility to sit down or not. I don't need language for that. But it's a question of relevance whether or not I sit down or not. It's not the chair that sits down, it's me. So there's a subjective. So it's the objective subjective meeting and then emerging properties arrive, which also to me answers the question that we always confront reality as not just present, but also possible futures. I might sit down. So the whole dimension of possibilities also as something that opens up for what possible futures could be is already in your definitions as I see it. But so maybe it was just a comment, but because I'm so inspired by your work. But I'm thinking maybe in less linguistic terms and more in social practice terms about it myself.
Excellent. Wow. Good question. Guido, do you want to respond?
Yes, thank you, Peter, and nice to see you finally. So yeah, I mean the domination versus power point that Peter was noting, I think it's an important one, because like I don't mean to say that domination or other specific cases of power are not power. The point is that they may or may not be, again, depending what is going on the side of the representation of possibilities, right? Sometimes the people in a dominant position are indeed powerful. Sometimes they're still dominant, but they are themselves sort of cogs in the machine. And the difference between the two cases, I think, is relevant, politically very relevant. So on the point about effective possibilities versus relevant possibilities, I don't think there is a disagreement there. It's just a matter of how to linguistically express the definition. And in fact, and perhaps this is a mistake from a rhetorical point of view, but in the book, there are different definitions of power, because the point is not that I want to, sort of fixate on a precise way to say it. The point is that I want to capture a meaning that already exists for us in English, in Italian, and in other languages, right? So what I mean by stressing that the possibilities are effective is that if they were not effective, we could again fall back in the case of the ivory tower theories that doesn't actually do anything in the world, just imagines stuff, right? That is not power. Like, yeah, you have to imagine to represent possibilities, etc., but these possibilities must be possible for you in an effective sense. Otherwise, you don't have power. Because like I can imagine all sorts of things, I can represent all sorts of possibility, but I can't actually have an effect in relation to these possibilities, and so I'm not really powerful, right? Okay. The relevant point, like the use of the word relevant, I guess it depends what you mean by relevant, because if by relevant you mean sort of important in an external sense, well, there can be big powers and small powers. So, sometimes even in a small context, something that might be considered irrelevant from another point of view still counts as power, even if a small one, right? But if by relevant you mean relevant for the actor themselves, then I agree completely. It's just that in my understanding, that was sort of already included in the point of the representation. Like representing something as a possibility means that, yes, you place relevance on that possibility. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother representing it as possible, right? I mean, for example, like one from an exceedingly sort of analytic point of view could say, oh, but don't I have the power to stand up and go to work? Well, is that politics? Well, no, but the reason is that we don't really think of those things as possibility in an ordinary way. We just do them sort of automatically because that's the way we live our lives, right? So they're not relevant possibilities, but that for me is sort of the same as saying that they are not represented as possibilities, right? So I don't disagree with the point about relevance. It's just a sort of lexical choice of what to include in the definition. But I don't disagree. I think I do disagree with the point about language, if I understood it correctly, because I do think the language is needed to represent possibilities. I do not believe that non-linguistic beings would be capable to form a representation of different states of the world and distinguish between what's possible, what's necessary, what's impossible. That to me seems to be incompatible with a non-linguistic being, right? Even when you look at the chair, as you said, I mean, sure, you're not explicitly thinking about language, but we gather together, this is the Kantian point, we gather together a sort of bunch of sensory inputs into the concept of a chair, well, with the aid of having the concept of a chair, which is linguistic. We wouldn't have that without language. So this might be sort of a fundamental philosophical choice, but that's how I see it. That's what I've been persuaded of by the linguistic turn and all the jazz, right? So yeah, that's how I see it. But thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Camilla?
Yes, I would like to please follow up on my previous questions, because even if you address the Palestinian-Israeli kind of conflict and the violence, it didn't address our, as citizens, our power. Because the idea of all the international structures, like the world that we built for ourselves, is like a structure of possibilities, right? That we create for ourselves. And we created that supposedly after 1945. And there are all kind of procedures and institutions that we are able to use in order to change the world in a way. However, we have been unable to do it. And for me, I would like for you to address that gap, basically, between the formal possibilities that are allowed, that are there for us. And we can talk about, law, rights, resolutions, everything that allows institutions, right, that allow us to exercise power. And the real, or our lack of power today, in the sense of that stalemate, that basically we see it happening, we see the violations, we see everything that can be done, we do it, and then nothing happens. So, and I think I would like to kind of follow up on Peter's position here, because it is all about, what we imagine capable, what we're capable of, and also Christine, the idea of possibility and impossibility, right? Because we, like, structurally and formally speaking, it is possible, right? But we haven't been able to do it. And we have been witnessing genocide for a year, and we have been able to do it, unable to do it. So that is what is, I think it's so illuminating of your book, in the sense that gives us the clarity to understand that even if there's probability that things will happen, and there actually are material possibilities, it is also part of our framing of things, of what are our limits as human beings, in what can we change our world. But in a way, I think I like very much Peter's framework in terms of power, of the possibility of changing the future, or creating an alternative future, right? Modifying the future in a manner that is not only about, dominating others, power over, but about structuring our world, the shared world, that we live in. And it's very Arendtian in this way, right? We are both very Arendtian. Lawrence doesn't like that much, but this is the part of the question. How what are we lacking from your perspective in terms of actually being able to exercise power today as citizens of the world, to stop what we should be stopping, in a way? Thank you.
Small question for you, Guido.
I think Peter had something to add.
Oh,
Yes,
I don't know if you want to do everything together or.
okay. I'm thinking, I'm feeling a little bit we're ganging up here, but I want to just add a comment to Camilla's. I think it's the question raised is about you define, and I agree. You relate your definition of power to something that has to do. It's individual. It's related to individual agency, and that of course leaves the question of group agency. Or you can go further, institutional agency and stuff like that. But I would just say group, because there's a lot of possibilities that we don't have as individuals, but that we have established by forming collective actions and institutions and groups. But I thought a lot about it, and I agree with you that there is something that you say about power that means that, of course, power, whether or not a power, if there's power at stake or not, needs to be conceptualized from an individual perspective, in a sense, or including a first person perspective. But that can include group membership or group agency, thinking about and being part of, pursuing possibilities through group agency. There's something there that I think is worth discussing further. So it's just a comment. Yeah, but that would open us how, for example, Lawrence, you had a question about how you, for example, how can you accept restrictions or necessities? Well, if you do it from a perspective of how your part of how you pursue possibilities evolves, for example, membership in groups or accepting institutional restrictions. For example, why should Trump accept that he loses the election? It's not because he should, it's about his agency. It's about, if you want to have the possibility to run the next time around, he should accept that he can win or lose. So it's part of actually individual agency to realize how restrictions of your immediate agency can also be expanding your agency, if you think in terms of group agency.
Yeah, I agree with that. But okay, so to Camilla's point, so why do we feel so powerless? Well, there are many reasons that have already been explored by much better scholars than me, and basically, I mean, I largely agree, right? We are embedded in a sort of gigantic world economic system that constrains what can be done. Our political institutions are often captured by this or that interest. There's a, the environmental crisis is pressing on us from all directions. There are all sorts of natural and social necessities that constrain what power we may have. And I don't have anything to say because that's not what I study. What you can add from my perspective is the kind of limiting of possibility that we do to ourselves, right? But I want to be clear, that's not to say that if we fix that, then everything will be fine, because all these other things, the hyper-complex society, the economy, the environment, conflict, war, all these other things still exist, and they objectively limit what is possible for us to do. However, what we do to ourselves, I think, is that we are incapable, in general, of thinking of our power, or what we want to realize in the world, outside of of a highly instrumental and teleological framework. And that leads us to trample over the institutions and the group practices that make power possible, right? I mean, I am unfortunately in the United States now. I think you see that very clearly in what is happening here, which again is not the only thing that's happening. I don't want to be the kind of theorist that finds an idea that explains everything, because there is already too many of those. But it is one of the things that's happening. Like, people are so committed to the realization of their end that they don't care to maintain the political space, the republic, the laws, the constitution. Those are all impediments to be trampled over as soon as you can. I think that's sort of a self-defeating attitude, in the sense that you may win the specific objective that you want, but you will make yourself and the others powerless in the process, which for me is not a good conditions to be in, right? So, to the question, how would we be more powerful? I don't have a good answer, because it depends on all these sort of circumstances, and I'm not good enough for that. But to the question of how should we understand our engagement in politics, I think the perspective I offer is that if we do want to be powerful, and it's difficult not to want to be powerful, because whatever specific goal you have, you do need power in order to realize it. So if we do want to be powerful, we should be much more attentive to maintaining the conditions for representing possibilities, as opposed to being locked down into a necessary orientation toward the actualization of a pre-given potentiality, right? So that's what I have to say. And to Peter's point about group agency, I agree, but like one of the reasons why I speak of person in the definition of power is also precisely to make space for the groups. Like, persons are not necessarily individual, right? States can be persons, associations can be persons, groups, right, can have their own personality, both in the legal sense and in a broader political sense. So when you have a group of people, and that could be activists, or it could be an academic department, or it could be a corporation, or it could be a political party that decides and orient themselves together as an actor, that is a person for the relevant purposes, and we can attribute power to them, right? When we speak of like, this political party cannot see the way out of their present conundrum, right? That's perfectly understandable, and I think perfectly reasonable. It means that as a collective person, the members of that party haven't figured out a path forward that is, practicable, understandable, and realizable, right? So I'm perfectly open to that. So the group situation is very important, and there's also like sort of where language and representation comes back into the picture, because this is more on the conception side than on the conceptual side. But I think it is correct to say that we do experience possibility only in relation to other people. If we are isolated, if we are completely alone, the space for possibility tends to dwindle and at the limit disappear, right? So we can have language only in a society, in a community with other people. We can represent possibilities only in that context. And it is really only in others that we see, that we have an experience of possibility. When people infuriate you because they just don't get your point, and that is a possibility. That is something that does not conform to your necessary logic. That is sort of the fundamental experience of a difference, which is also an exemplar of possibility rather than necessity. So groups are everywhere at all levels of this analysis. But the more specific point is simply about, when I talk about persons, I mean both individuals and groups, if by groups we mean groups that are capable of acting together. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat from Tubanal that I think is picks up on a similar point. But I'm going to ask Lawrence to ask the final question, and then you can respond both to the comments in the chat and to Lawrence. So over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to reinforce in a way what Guido was just saying, despite what I said earlier. To say, and just to come back to Peter's point, and in a way, Camilla's point as well, about, how can we be more powerful and the significance of groups and group representation in politics. I think one of the problems with, let's call it left or radical left thinking, is the tendency to not see significantly the centrality of group and group representation in politics, and how it can enable us to see beyond, as it were, the conditions of our times, both by being constrained in the way that Guido's just been describing, but also by seeing, partly as a consequence of that constraint, by seeing beyond it. And there's an unfortunate tendency to think that thinking about groups and thinking about representation in a slightly different way than maybe Guido's just been describing is always somehow a conservative way of thinking about politics, when in actual fact it can be radically emancipatory as well.
Thank you, Lawrence. Guido, I'm going to give you last opportunity to have the last word. You can treat that as a possibility for you and a necessity for the rest of us.
I mean, hopefully there will be more words in the future. I mean, the world doesn't end with this stream, hopefully. Okay, so to respond to the question in the chat from Tuba, is that how it's pronounced? I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. I apologize. So I agree. Like it is interesting to think about institutions and international structures, and I think it is not correct to think about that in opposition to power, right? I think mainstream international relations theory has a tendency to conceive of power as sort of the application of brute force or the threat thereof. But that is sort of born of the very construction of the discipline, because by focusing on the international stage, they already presuppose that there exist states that are actors on the international stage, right? So, in a sense, they are correct in their use of power in an unregulated international relations sphere, but only because the possibility aspect is happening, at least in the theory, at the state level already. They are sort of covertly presupposing a space for politics that doesn't work anything like the kind of politics that they presuppose at the international level, and then they speak of the power that these actors have on the international level, right? But yes, I think that laws and institutions are not polar opposites to power, but rather it is necessary to dwell in a norm-regulated space in order to be in the best position to have, gain and exert power. Because what happens when there are no norms is that violence rules or the threat of violence, and that is a necessitating framework, right? So in that sense, I think, yes, there should be more attention to that, but not in the sense of opposing a sort of idealistic liberal internationalism to the crass self-interest of the realist state conflict, right? Rather with the recognition that you can have a space for power if you try your best to keep violence at bay, even while recognizing that in some cases violence might be necessary, or in other cases might be used as an implement for power. But it is an implement for power that is always also in some degree corrosive of the conditions for power, right? But again, it's not an all of nothing proposition. It's a dynamic situation, a dynamic space that is always constantly renegotiated, right? So you can imagine limit situations in which power disappears completely, but that's not the usual context in which we find ourselves, right? I mean, there would be much more to say, but that's for another occasion. Yeah, and to Lauren's point, yeah, I mean, I simply agree. Like the representation aspect is fundamental, and we can't really even think about power if we imagine ourselves as not belonging to any group, right? Maybe we can be philosophers, but we cannot be political actors if we don't pay attention to the dimension of groups and their representation. Yeah. So okay, I think that's what I got for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as we run out of time, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and especially our respondents, Christine, Lawrence, and Camilla, but mostly obviously Guido, for your great book and this fascinating session. And yeah, thank you and Camilla especially, for this idea of doing our first live stream book seminar. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.